The studio lights were bright, almost too bright. Jimmy Kimmel's usual charm radiated through the cameras as the live audience roared with anticipation. But behind that polished grin was something colder, something sharpened. Sitting across from him was Clint Eastwood, a man who had never bowed to public opinion, who wore his age and grit like armor. He had been invited to promote his latest film, a quiet, powerful Western that critics had praised. But this wasn't going to be a soft conversation. From the moment Clint stepped onto the stage, the energy shifted. Kimmel greeted him with a handshake that lingered just a second too long. Clint's eyes narrowed subtly. He could smell it already. Condescension cloaked in showbiz politeness. The applause died down, and Jimmy dove straight into the questions. But not the usual warm-up kind. There was no gentle let-in. Instead, Kimmel brought up Clint's controversial remarks from a past press conference, accusing him of glorifying violence in his films and refusing to evolve with the times. The crowd gave a nervous chuckle, unsure if this was banter or bait. Clint's jaw tightened. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He leaned forward, voice low and steady, not bothering to hide his disdain. The tension was instant. Viewers at home could feel it. This wasn't two celebrities chatting on late-night television. This was a brewing clash between old-school integrity and modern showbiz cynicism. Jimmy, sensing the discomfort in the air, doubled down. He accused Eastwood of pushing a narrative that America no longer needed, of promoting rugged masculinity at a time when softness, empathy, and inclusion were finally finding a voice. Clint responded with something sharper than anger. It was disgust. Not just at the implication, but at the host's smugness, his inability to separate entertainment from reality. He questioned whether Kimmel had ever done anything real, whether he had ever stood for something instead of sitting behind a desk pointing fingers. The audience quieted. A few people shifted in their seats. The interview had taken a dark turn, and they knew it wasn't part of the act. Kimmel laughed, but the sound rang hollow. He fired back, calling Clint outdated and irrelevant, hinting that his career was clinging to legacy rather than vision. That was the trigger. Clint didn't raise his voice, but his words cut like glass. He reminded Jimmy and everyone watching what it meant to build a career without selling your soul, without begging for likes and applause. The crowd didn't know whether to cheer or hold their breath. The atmosphere turned heavy. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a generational clash, a philosophical war fought in real time. Jimmy's attempts to turn the moment into a joke fell flat. Clint didn't smile. He didn't let him off the hook. And just when it seemed like things might settle, Kimmel delivered a final jab. It wasn't just about the films anymore. It was personal. A reference to Clint's family, his past decisions as a father and husband, an unnecessary, deeply personal low blow masked as a question. Clint leaned back, his stare drilling through the host. No one said a word. The air in the studio thinned. The show was still live, but the fake smiles and scripted laughs were gone. What remained was real, raw, and uncomfortable, and Clint was just getting started. There was a moment just after Jimmy Kimmel crossed the line when the entire room seemed to freeze. The cameras kept rolling, the stage lights hummed, but time slowed around Clint Eastwood's silence. He didn't explode. He didn't lash out. That would have been too easy. Instead, he stared through Kimmel like he wasn't even there. It was the kind of look that had made audiences shudder in his films, but this wasn't a movie. This was real, and Jimmy had no script to hide behind. Clint shifted in his seat and adjusted his posture with the precision of a man who had buried too many insults in his lifetime. But this one wasn't going to be buried. This wasn't some online hit piece. This was face-to-face, and Clint Eastwood was never the type to let a personal dig pass without consequence. His words landed with the weight of a man who had lived through wars, lost friends, and survived decades in an industry that now treated him like an antique. He called Kimmel out, not just for the jab at his family, but for the hypocrisy. For the way late-night hosts had become judges of morality while hiding behind writers and lighting crews. He told him, plainly, that a man who spends his nights mocking others had no right to talk about decency. And when Clint said it, there wasn't a single trace of performance in his voice. It was raw, it was uncomfortable, and it was true. Jimmy tried to shift the mood, throwing out a nervous joke, hoping the audience would laugh and restore the safety net. But no one laughed. The silence from the crowd was louder than anything he could say. He had underestimated Clint. He thought he could poke the bear and control the reaction. But Clint wasn't there to play along. Still, Kimmel wasn't done. Ego demanded retaliation. He accused Clint of being part of a dying generation too stubborn to admit its flaws. He mocked his old-fashioned ideals, the silence in his films, the moral codes his characters lived by. He said it was fantasy, an outdated illusion created by a man who never evolved. And this time, his voice rose. He wasn't interviewing anymore. He was lashing out, trying to win a fight he had started but couldn't control. Clint, unmoved, stood his ground. But his demeanor had changed. He wasn't just responding now, he was taking over. He spoke about the cost of change when it's hollow, when it's forced to appease trends instead of building something lasting. He challenged Jimmy, asking what he had ever built that mattered. Not a skit, not a viral moment, but something that would still be worth something years from now. Kimmel faltered. For the first time, his face cracked with genuine discomfort. The audience saw it, the producers backstage saw it, and Clint saw it. The mood spiraled further when Clint mentioned the difference between visibility and respect. He said you can be everywhere and still be meaningless. That being loud didn't make someone right. That was when Jimmy snapped. He raised his voice. He leaned forward. He told Clint, flatly, that this was his show, his stage, and that if Clint couldn't handle being questioned, he shouldn't have shown up. And Clint stood. Not slowly, not dramatically, but with finality. Like he had made a decision hours ago, and was only now acting on it. The audience gasped, unsure if this was a stunt or reality. But it was all real. Clint Eastwood, Hollywood legend, turned away from the desk and began walking off the stage without looking back. Kimmel called after him, first with disbelief, then irritation. But Clint didn't respond. Not a single word. That silence said more than any monologue ever could. But just before Clint reached the edge of the stage, he paused. Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of the stage, still beneath the studio lights, but with his back to Jimmy Kimmel. The audience held its breath, waiting, not sure what was coming next. He hadn't said a word since rising from his chair, but something about the way he paused, deliberate, unhurried, sent a ripple through the room. Then, slowly, he turned his head over his shoulder, just enough to face the man behind the desk one last time. What Clint said next didn't come with theatrics or fury. It was quiet, almost calm, but it hit the room like a freight train. He told Jimmy that walking away wasn't weakness, it was strength. That sometimes the greatest statement a man can make is refusing to participate in something beneath him. And tonight, Clint said, the show had become exactly that. Beneath him. The room didn't move. Even Jimmy's crew, normally quick to adjust, didn't know how to react. The audience, filled with people expecting a cheerful plug for Clint's movie, were instead witnessing a public unraveling of ego, showmanship, and pride. Kimmel leaned back in his chair, his smirk gone, replaced with something closer to frustration, maybe even fear. Not fear of Clint, but fear of what was now exposed, his loss of control, his inability to recover the interview, and the slow realization that the moment was no longer his to direct. He tried to grab it back, throwing out one last dig about Clint being too fragile for live television. The words felt forced, desperate. Clint didn't even acknowledge them. Instead, he gave one final look to the audience, his face blank, but his eyes filled with clarity. Then he walked off, straight through the curtain, and disappeared from the stage. There was no music to soften the moment, no scripted laughter to patch over the silence. For several long seconds, Jimmy sat there, eyes locked on the now empty seat. The show was still live, but it no longer felt like a show. It felt like something had broken. Finally, he looked into the camera and tried to salvage it. He joked that the old cowboy couldn't handle a little heat. A few people in the crowd gave a half-hearted laugh, but most remained quiet. They had seen the truth, and no amount of charm or jokes could change what had just happened. Backstage, Clint didn't ask to be escorted. He didn't speak to staff or linger in the hall. He walked straight out of the building, past executives and assistants who scrambled to process the damage. Paparazzi outside tried to catch a comment, but he ignored them. He had said everything he needed to. Meanwhile, social media exploded. Clips of the confrontation began circulating within minutes. Viewers were divided. Some called Kimmel brave for challenging Eastwood's outdated ideals. Others saw it differently, that Kimmel had tried to humiliate a legend for views and ended up embarrassing himself in front of millions. The story took on a life of its own. Hashtags trended, headlines formed. Late-night television, which so often relied on predictable laughs and safe controversies, had finally delivered something raw, and audiences couldn't look away. Producers debated how to handle it. Should they pull the segment? Edit it? Release a statement? But no spin could fix what had played out on screen. It wasn't just a bad interview. It was a collapse. A high-stakes moment where reputation and legacy collided under studio lights. And Jimmy Kimmel, for all his wit and wordplay, was now sitting in the wreckage of it. The next morning, headlines erupted. Every major outlet replayed the moment Clint Eastwood stood, turned his back on Jimmy Kimmel, and walked away. The clip was dissected on news channels, reaction videos flooded the internet, and both camps, Clint's supporters and Jimmy's defenders, fought for narrative control. But what no one could deny was the truth beneath the spectacle. Something unscripted had taken place, something real. And in an industry built on illusion, that truth hit harder than anyone expected. Jimmy Kimmel returned to his set that night with a strained smile. The crowd clapped, though the energy was different. There was tension in the air, an unspoken question. Would he address what happened, or pretend it never did? He chose the former, but not in the way anyone expected. He opened the show with a monologue veiled in sarcasm. He mocked Clint's demeanor, his refusal to engage, even his walk off stage. He painted the altercation as a generational meltdown, suggesting Clint couldn't handle progressive values or tough questions. The audience gave him polite laughter, but it was thin, almost obligatory. Underneath the surface, the confidence wasn't there. Jimmy was trying to reclaim his authority, but it sounded like a man trying to convince himself he still had it. What he didn't expect was what came next. Later in the show, during a commercial break, a producer handed Jimmy a phone with a message. Clint Eastwood had issued a statement, not to the media, not to the studio, but directly to the American Film Board during a live panel. His message wasn't angry or defensive. It was reflective. He spoke about the shifting values in media, the rise of empty outrage over meaningful dialogue, and the way late night had become a stage for pre-scripted conflict masquerading as conversation. He didn't mention Kimmel by name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew who he meant. The room went silent when Jimmy read the message backstage. It wasn't a retort. It was something deeper, an indictment of an entire culture of entertainment that had traded truth for applause, soul for relevance, and the fallout hit harder than Jimmy had prepared for. Critics who once favored Kimmel's edgy commentary began questioning the approach. Was it courage or cruelty? Was calling out guests for their personal lives ethical, or just bait for viral outrage? Kimmel's public persona had always walked the line between comedian and commentator, But now that line had blurred. The moment with Clint had turned him into something else, a symbol of entertainment's growing disconnection from respect and substance. Even fellow celebrities began to weigh in. Some defended Kimmel, calling the moment a necessary disruption. But others, including respected figures from both film and television, sided with Clint. They saw the walk-off as an act of dignity, a refusal to be reduced to a caricature for the sake of viewership. Behind the scenes, Jimmy wasn't handling it well. The smugness began to slip in off-camera moments. He snapped at staff, grew defensive during meetings, and privately questioned whether the segment should have aired at all. Executives stood by the decision. Controversy was ratings. But Jimmy was beginning to feel the weight of the backlash. What was meant to be just another late-night appearance had become a cultural moment, and he was on the losing end of it. Meanwhile, Clint stayed quiet. He didn't tour the news networks. He didn't post clips or seek applause. He returned to the set of his film as if the entire thing never happened. But people noticed something different in how the media talked about him. Not as an aging relic, but as a man who still had the power to command a room without shouting, to deliver impact without needing a punchline. And the more Jimmy tried to regain control through humor and mockery, the more hollow it felt. He had started a fight he thought he could win, but the real damage was only now beginning to show. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the Kimmel-Eastwood clash grew into something larger than either of them anticipated. It stopped being just about one interview. It became a symbol of what happens when entertainment pushes too far, when respect is discarded for cheap applause. Talk shows and op-ed columns circled the moment like vultures, hungry to pick it apart. But through all the noise, one truth rang clearer than anything else. Clint Eastwood didn't just walk off a stage. He walked into something timeless. Public opinion began to shift, slowly but unmistakably. Audiences, once desensitized to artificial conflict, began to see through the performance. Clint's silence after the incident, his refusal to fight back through the usual media echo chambers, came off as something rare in today's world. Grace. He didn't retaliate with insults or scripted sound bites. He simply stood firm, made his statement by leaving, and let the world decide who truly walked away with their dignity. And they did. Clint's new film, initially overshadowed by the scandal, exploded in popularity, not just because of curiosity, but because people wanted to see what kind of man could carry himself like that. Theaters sold out. Online platforms saw streaming numbers spike. It wasn't just the story on screen that pulled them in. It was the man behind the camera. The man who refused to be humiliated for the sake of a punchline. Meanwhile, Kimmel's show limped forward. The studio still drew crowds, but something had shifted. A hesitation in the laughter, a quiet pause after each monologue, as if viewers were waiting for the mask to slip again. Guests became more cautious. Publicists asked more questions. Some even canceled, not wanting to risk becoming the next viral victim of forced controversy. Jimmy, once the king of calculated edge, now found himself walking a tighter rope, one misstep away from another fall. One evening, weeks after the incident, Jimmy aired a quiet segment at the end of his show. No fanfare, no jokes, just a few words about humility, timing, and the cost of forgetting that every guest in the chair across from him was a human being first. He didn't mention Clint. He didn't have to. The gesture was clear. But it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done. Clint, on the other hand, gave a single follow-up interview, not to a network, but to a quiet independent publication known for avoiding celebrity noise. In it, he spoke calmly about the state of conversation in America, about how people had lost the ability to disagree without destroying. He said walking away wasn't about defeat, but clarity, that there comes a time when a man must decide what part of himself is worth protecting, and for him that decision had been simple. The interview was brief, elegant, and direct. It trended for days. But Clint wasn't interested in trends. He returned to his quiet work, filming in deserts and canyons, directing with a stillness that commanded respect. Young actors who joined his crew spoke in hushed admiration. He didn't shout. He didn't beg to be heard. He just was. And in an age where most chased relevance like a drug, that kind of presence felt radical. By the end of the year, Clint's film won several major awards, not because of sympathy but because it earned them. The industry, once eager to label him as part of a fading era, now embraced him as something rare, genuine. And as his film closed its final scene with a lone rider disappearing into the horizon, audiences rose to their feet, not just in theaters, but in spirit. Because they weren't just watching a movie. They were witnessing the mark of a man who refused to be reduced. Back in Hollywood, late-night hosts adjusted. Interviews softened, conversations deepened. A subtle but unmistakable shift began. One man's walkout had forced everyone else to rethink how they stayed seated. And in that quiet, powerful revolution, Clint Eastwood didn't just walk out of a room. He walked into legend.